What we're taught in college and medical school is that the brain creates all of our thoughts and feelings. But in fact, when you look at things like near-death experiences where the brain is shutting down and the mind seems to be clearer than ever, they've done neuroimaging and they find that the more elaborate the mystical experience is, the less coordination there is in the brain waves. When the brain gets out of the way, then you have this flowering of consciousness. Now that's hard to make sense in terms of the way we usually think of neurophysiology. But these experiences certainly suggest that under extreme circumstances, the mind can function when the brain is not. And if that's true, if the mind can function when the brain is going offline, that raises the question of whether the mind can continue to function after the brain dies completely, after our bodies die. And certainly near-death experiences suggest that that can happen.
Today we are bringing on Dr. Bruce Greyson. Bruce is actually considered the father of research for near-death experiences. Literally, he is the guy who invented the scale that actually measures, defines, qualifies, and corroborates a near-death experience internationally. So like everybody that's ever been involved with near-death experience research uses his tool. He's researched over 1,000 people that have had near-death experiences and tells me that apparently 1 in 20 people in the world has had a near-death experiences. It's crazy. He is really pushing the bounds of what neuroscience has been telling us, our concepts of reality, how we perceive of the mind and the brain versus consciousness overall. And a lot of what medical school teaches, he's saying is actually not actually what's going on. He is the professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences, and he's a professor of psychiatric medicine at the University of Virginia. Ultimately, this is all based in science. From a science perspective, what is going on in the mind and why we have these near-death experiences. Are they actually a thing? Are they real? And if so, what does that mean? Let's get into it.
You've been studying near-death experiences for literally years now. And you've actually invented the near-death experience scale, which is currently, from what I understand, the most used tool that's allowing the standardized identification of near-death experiences worldwide. So you've earned a lot of credibility there. You've been studying this for years. Everybody who studies this uses your methodology to do it. I've personally juggled with this concept of near-death experiences myself, whether they're, real or not. I do have an open mind, but it does come off a little bit wooey, you know what I mean? But with that, I am very open to it. And the more I've listened to them, the more I feel like there's something there. So I guess what I'm hoping for is, can you tell me why your work matters? And especially in the context of its meaning of how we think of, reality, our understanding of science and overall consciousness, how this challenges that.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in a scientific household that was purely materialistic. We had no spiritual or religious training. So we thought the physical world was all there was, and when you die, you die. That's the end of it. And when I first encountered what I later learned was a near-death experience, it made no sense to me at all. It was totally out there. I couldn't believe it was happening. I thought somebody was playing a trick on me. But then I started hearing more and more of them and realized this is not something that's just 1 or 2 crazy stories. That's something that's really going on. But it didn't make sense to me from a scientific perspective. So I thought, well, as a scientist, you don't run away from things you don't understand. Right. You run toward them and try to make sense out of them. So I started collecting more and more cases to try to figure out what's going on here, expecting that I would find a simple physical explanation for them. And 50 years later, I'm still trying to find that explanation. I'm a psychiatrist, and I've made my living trying to help people make changes in their lives. It's just not an easy job. It takes a lot of work over weeks and months. And here's this experience that takes seconds or sometimes a fraction of a second, and it totally transforms someone's attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior. And it doesn't, it lasts forever. I've talked to people who had the experience decades ago, and they say, my life has never been the same. And that, I think, makes them profoundly interesting to a psychiatrist. There are other things about the experience that I have not been able to explain in a quote, rational way. And that makes me more interested from a philosophical perspective. And I'm basically not a philosopher.
So it's like, I think you were talking to me when we first met too. There was that one event with that, I think he was a 9-year-old kid. And his sister was involved. Can you remind me of that story? Because
Right.
I think that was really compelling.
Yeah, well, this is one of the odd things. About 30% of people who have a near-death experience say that they encountered a deceased loved one in the experience, and if that can easily be dismissed as just wishful thinking and imagination, expectations. You think you're dying, so of course you want to meet your deceased father or mother or grandparents. So you imagine that. But in many cases now, we have documentation that no one knew the person seen during the near-death experience had actually died. They thought they were still alive. And yet the person having the experience saw them in this other realm. And this boy is one of those. He was a 9-year-old boy who was hospitalized with a severe illness. He was had a high fever, and he was basically comatose. And his parents were with him all night long in the hospital because they weren't sure he was going to survive. And around 3 a.m, he suddenly woke up and was very active and very excited and wanted to tell his parents that he had been to heaven. And they just wanted to calm him down, and he said, no, I saw, my grandpa, and I saw Uncle Leo, and, and I saw Teresa. Well, Teresa was his sister who was away in college, and they didn't know what to make of that. So they asked him, what do you mean you saw her? He said, well, I saw her there, and she told me I had to come back. And they got very upset about this. They didn't know what to make of it. So they asked the doctor actually to give him something to calm him down. And once they were satisfied that he was under good control, they went home. And there on the answering machine of their home phone was a message from the college that the daughter had been killed in a car accident earlier that night. Now, there's no way any of them had known about that, and yet somehow this 9-year-old boy said he saw her in his near-death experience.
That's crazy. When you told me that,
Yes.
I mean, it's almost impossible not to kind of question everything with that piece of information.
Exactly.
Well, so with that, was that when there was no cell phones or something? Because like there's a home phone, they couldn't.
Right. That was back in the 70s. I published a paper with about 30 such cases like this, and they actually go back to ancient Greece and Rome. Pliny the Elder wrote about a very detailed case of this type in the 1st century. So they're not a new phenomenon.
What would they write about? What would they say?
Well, this is the one that Pliny wrote about was a Roman nobleman who died, and his brother was making the arrangements for the with the funeral home, and he made the arrangements, and the dead brother was on the slab, ready to be embalmed. And as the undertaker came in to do the embalming, he suddenly sat up. The supposedly dead man sat up, and he said he had just been to his brother's house. He was unconscious there on the slab. He'd been to his brother's house, and he said his brother had died. And his brother told him, his dead brother told him, that the funeral arrangements should be used for him rather than for the brother who now seemed to be alive. And he also told this brother who is now alive where he had buried the family fortune in the backyard. So, the undertaker doesn't know what to make of this because this is his dead patient who suddenly became alive. And as he's sitting there stunned, the servant of the brother who had made the arrangements comes running in saying, "My master's just died." So we have a similar case here where someone woke up from apparent death saying, "I just saw my deceased relative that no one had known was dead." And that was 2,000 years ago. Right.
And it's all documented. Did he find the gold or whatever?
That's the story, but this is 2,000 years old, so we can't corroborate it
Yeah.
now. But we have cases from the last 3-4 decades that we have been able to corroborate.
You have been able to. And some of the ones that I've heard that were particularly compelling to me were, I think there was this one where this woman was in the hospital and she had supposedly passed, and then she was floating outside of her body. It seems to be this common thing where they like pop out of their bodies. Because I've talked to a few near-death experiencers, I don't know what you call them, on this channel, and they've told me that you just kind of pop out of your body. So this person just popped out, and it sounds like they floated somewhere in the hospital up onto the highest floor, and they saw like a shoe, just a left. Have you heard this?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then they came back to life, and the nurse was in the room, didn't know that they were going to come back to life. And the person who had come back to life was like, I'm telling you, there's a shoe up there, and it's this, I don't know, somebody's lost it or something like that. And it turned out to be true. Those kinds of things. Is that, did I get that pretty right, or did I mess that up?
It's pretty close. Yeah. It was a woman who was brought into the hospital in a cardiac arrest, and she was unconscious. And when she woke up from consciousness several hours later, she said that she had been around the hospital, and on the outside edge, a windowsill, they're up on like the 5th floor. On the far side of the hospital, there was a blue tennis shoe on the ledge of the windowsill.
Yeah, okay.
And she said, it's got a scuffed toe, and the shoelace is tucked under the heel. And they just thought she was either delusional or just making this up. But the social worker actually went from room to room, pushing her head against the window, trying to find the shoe, and she actually found it right where the woman said it was.
Can you imagine finding that? Well, you probably could. You've talked to so many of these people. Have you spoken with that woman?
Yes. No, I haven't. I've talked to the social worker who found.
Oh, really? What did she say?
Yeah. She was pretty stunned by it. She got corroboration from other people who actually were part of that story. The nurse involved with the patient. The patient herself was a migrant laborer who didn't speak much English, and she didn't stay in that town for long. So we sort of lost her. But we have the stories of the staff that worked in the hospital with her.
This is why it's so compelling too. A lot of what I find interest in is these sort of fringe topics that I think deserve more credit. There's there's so much momentum behind our existing beliefs and what we think, makes sense because science proved it. But part of the joy of science is that it's kind of ever evolving and changing.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And I think that if we don't examine these things, we're not actually examining science. There's something lost there. And there's endless stories of this. How many people did you say I think have experienced near-death experiences?
Well, it's about 5% of the general population, which is 1 out of every 20 people.
That's crazy.
Meet. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, 1 out of every 20 people. So you probably know a few personal people that have.
Oh, yes. There's someone in your family or in your classroom, in your workplace who's had one. They may not have told you about it yet because many people are still ashamed to mention it. They're afraid they'll be called crazy.
All that kind of stuff. What even defines a near-death experience? Like, that's what I want to know is what is the standard versus, do they have to die? Did their heart have to stop? Did they have to stop breathing? Right?
Yeah, you don't have to. Many people do stop breathing. Their hearts stop. And they have this elaborate experience. But some people have the same experience when their hearts have not stopped as far as we know. For example, people who fall off mountain climbing and they fall down the mountain. As far as we know, their hearts haven't stopped, but they may have a full-blown near-death experience. Or people who are in automobile accidents and they think they're going to die, but something happens and they aren't saved. They don't die. And yet they have a near-death experience. Of course, no one's measuring their heart rate. We don't know what happened to them, but we assume that their hearts didn't stop. But what usually happens is that in this near-death state, or sometimes when they're even pronounced dead, and their brains are not presumably functioning very well, their thoughts and emotions and their perceptions are heightened. They're more vivid than ever. Their thoughts are clearer. Their perceptions are sharper. And this is pretty inexplicable in terms of how we think the brain works. They also have very strong emotions, usually very positive emotions. This is in the context of coming close to death where you're either frightened or in pain or both, and you're suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of well-being and unconditional love. You also have these bizarre experiences like seeing things around your body that you shouldn't be able to see, and then encountering so-called otherworldly things like deceased loved ones, and some people think they see deities who may judge them or lead them on a life review, so they judge themselves and then send them back to life.
Right. Yeah, I've listened to and talked to quite a lot of them. And they all have this overwhelming, like, it's this like sensation of love and belonging, but also it's very clear. There, like clarity is huge.
Yes.
Yeah, that part is huge. And honestly, I should have asked you this further, but for anybody that's, I mean, help me understand your background too and how you got into this. I should have asked you this before, but what is this evolution now that gives you that credibility to be able to have all these people around the world using your format for identifying what a near-death experience is?
Yeah. Well, I was raised as a scientist, and I usually use the scientific method for all my research. I went into this field expecting that I was find a simple physical explanation in what was going on in the physiology of the brain. And we gradually collected enough cases that we could do an analysis of what features were common across cultures, across religions, across ages and genders. And out of that, we made this near-death experience scale, the NDE scale, with 16 elements that seemed to be common regardless of the person's personality or physiology or culture. And then we started looking at what might be associated with this, what might be sort of causing it. We looked at the obvious physiological things. Is it lack of oxygen to the brain? Is it drugs given to the patient? That kind of thing. And each one we've tested turns out to be not the case. For example, if you look at how much oxygen is getting to the brains of people in near-death situations, those who have a near-death experience actually have better oxygen supply than those who don't have a near-death experience.
And that's when you're measuring them in a hospital? Okay.
Yeah. And of course, we can't measure most people because they're not in the hospital.
Right.
Likewise, with drugs given to people, the more drugs people are given, the less likely they are to report a near-death experience.
The more drugs they're given, the less likely they are to have a near-death experience overall.
Yeah. Now, wait. I have to qualify that. What it may mean is that the more drugs you're given, the less likely you are to be able to remember it later on. And likewise, with lack of oxygen, maybe that just stops you from being able to remember it later on.
You know, a lot of people liken this to taking drugs. And what I mean by drugs is like plant medicine, possibly acid. There's a lot of study going on these days about drugs. And it's such a loaded word, right? Because it's all... I'm not necessarily saying everybody should go and do them all, whatever, but there's mushrooms for veterans now to help them with PTSD. There's that psilocybin, and that was actually just legalized in Colorado and in Oregon, I believe. And then you've got, I believe it was the 70s when acid was what was the word? It was like banned, I guess, or legalized. It was criminalized. But before that, it was used as a way for people to kind of like open into different dimensions. I mean, there's other things too, right? Where if you really are looking to deep dive into oneself, people take these substances to kind of understand consciousness in their mind versus their brain, right? And then their body. And what does that really mean? And then you get away from all of that and there's meditation. All of these things are ultimately a way to kind of like understand consciousness. Have you seen these correlations, between near-death experiences and these kinds of like substances that one could use, or meditation?
Right. Well, I grew up in the 60s when there was a lot of LSD around, so I saw a lot of it.
You would.
And, back in those days, it was mostly LSD and things like that, some psilocybin. But as you said, it became illegal after a while back in the Nixon administration. And it wasn't until the last 15, 20 years that it became permissible to do medical research on these drugs. And there's a lot of research being done, particularly at Johns Hopkins University in this country and at Imperial College in London, mostly with psilocybin, because that's the easiest one to control. But there's also a lot of work being done now with ketamine, which is used to treat first depression and now PTSD. And both drugs can produce experiences that are very similar to a near-death experience. They're not identical. We used to think that they don't produce the same after effects, but some of the research coming out of Hopkins now suggests that taking psilocybin under certain conditions can lower your death anxiety and your anxiety in general for months. And now they've done studies up to a couple of years after the experience. Now, I've talked to a lot of people who have done both, had a near-death experience and tried these drugs. And they say that they are similar, but they're not the same. One person said, when I was taking psilocybin, I saw heaven. When I had my near-death experience, I was in heaven.
Ah, that's interesting. That's cool.
So they draw this distinction.
Dang, what a lucky person too to have seen.
Yeah.
Dang.
Others told me it's like, if you watch a movie about war, and then you actually are in battle, if you describe to someone, use the same words to describe what you're seeing and what you're hearing, but nobody would think it's the same experience. It's just that there's so many words you can use to describe what it is. And because you're using the same words doesn't mean it's the same experience.
Right. And they talk about anything to do with ayahuasca is a huge one too. Have they ever mentioned anything with ayahuasca before? Have you heard that?
Yes. That's not been done with medical research. Ayahuasca is a difficult drug to use. It's usually used in rituals, not in this country, but in South America. And people have compared the ayahuasca experiences with near-death experiences, and they do seem very similar, but it's not in any controlled experiments. So there's a limit to how much we can conclude from those studies.
Okay. It's funny. I've actually done ayahuasca myself in a ritual too for a couple of days. So it wasn't, I've never had a near-death experience, so I can't say, what it was like. But, you see different dimensions of this world. You feel different. You feel very, it depends on what the music sounds like, but I felt very, very happy and enlightened. And then I know that's part of the reaction of, the actual drug in the body, but probably the closest thing I could correlate to what I've heard of near-death experiencers when they have these kinds of experiences is like this, I don't know if the word's like euphoria, right? But it's almost like, you were saying before, it's like love, belonging, but it's also like,
yes,
it's acceptance, all these feelings that we strive for in our day-to-day that you're getting suddenly. And it's like immediate, I think, with them, isn't it?
Yeah. We were hoping that this research into psychedelic drugs would give us some clues as to what might be going on in the brain when you have these experiences. So I was part of an international group that studied a large number of near-death experience accounts. I think it was around 800, and then 15,000 accounts of drug experiences with different types of drugs. And we're trying to look at what types of drugs produce the experience that was most like a near-death experience. And in that study, ketamine seemed to be the drug that mimicked the NDE most.
That's interesting. Huh.
Psilocybin was second. Salvia or sage was third. And the thing was that each one of these drugs that were in the top 5, or in fact, the top 10, act by different mechanisms in the brain. So it didn't really tell you what's the mechanism in the brain that lets these things happen, because almost any mechanism seems to be can do it.
So what is going on in the brain then? We don't know that yet, right?
We don't.
Okay.
But let me say that what we're taught in college and medical school is that the brain creates all of our thoughts and feelings. They like to say the mind is what the brain does. But in fact, when you look at things like near-death experiences where the brain is shutting down and the mind seems to be clearer than ever, or even if psychedelic drugs, they've done neuroimaging of people in psychedelic drug trips, and they find that the more elaborate the mystical experience is with drugs, the less coordination there is in the brain waves, the lower the voltage and the less coordination. So again, it seems like when the brain gets out of the way, then you have this flowering of consciousness. Now that's hard to make sense in terms of the way we usually think of neurophysiology. But it's not a new observation. Hippocrates wrote about this 2,000 years ago. He said the brain is the messenger of the mind. And there's been this metaphor going through the ages that it's like, in 20th century terms, it's like a television set. You can't see the show without a set that's working. And when the set goes on the blink, you don't see the show, but the show is still there. The waves out there are still there. You just don't have a TV set to watch them with. But your television set is not creating the show. And in the same way, they say the brain is not creating your thoughts. It's receiving them the way a television set receives signals and then translating these signals into what your body can understand.
That makes a lot of sense to me because I think we talked about this a bit before too, with this concept of vibrations and frequencies and the power of thought.
Yes.
It's really one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on, Bruce, was because I feel that you do challenge a lot of what common science says, a lot of what theory is, that we it's not that it's bad, but we get stuck in it. And a lot of what I'm fascinated by is all of these systems that exist, that they got us to the next step, but now we exist in them and we're not moving forward to the next phase, right? You see that all over the place. You see that with big food. I talk about that a lot here about our food system. You see that in healthcare. I mean, it's just all this stuff with healthcare is crazy, cholesterol. But all of the people I'm speaking to are unearthing kind of like the I don't want to say the truth because that sounds like other people are lying, but it is basically like a new set of information, let's say, that is revealing that other things are either outdated or maybe are a bit skewed. And that's what people are living in. And I think what you did really well in what you have done super well in your research that I really appreciated and in your book was you talked about the mind is separate than the brain. That's a huge factor to what you're talking about right now, which is we've all been convinced through medical school that it's one and the same, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that science is wrong. I'm saying that their models are limited. And let me give you an example. People used to think that the world is flat, and now we think it's round. Well, there was good reason to think it's flat because in everyday life, it certainly looks that way. So if you're just looking at your immediate environment, that's a good model for how the world works. The world is flat. It's only when you get to extreme cases like flying up in the air or traveling far distances that you get to see, well, it's not really that way. So I think, there are models that work like Newtonian mechanics, like we're all just little billiard balls with molecules running around, works very well for everyday life. But when you get to very tiny subatomic particles or very fast speeds close to the speed of light, that model breaks down and you need relativity and quantum mechanics to make sense out of the data you get. So again, the model that we're using for science works perfectly fine in everyday life, but not in extreme cases. So the model that the brain creates our thoughts works great in everyday life. When you get drunk, that affects your thinking. If you have a stroke or brain disease, that affects your thinking. But in extreme circumstances, like when the brain is stopping, like when you're near death or dying, then the mind seems to separate from the brain and doesn't seem to need the brain to function.
So can you guys measure that in any way, or how are you able to see that?
That's a great question. We don't really have ways of directly measuring the mind. What we can do is measure the effects. It's like trying to measure emotions. You can't measure an emotion. If someone's in love or is angry, you can't directly measure that, but you can measure their behavior and infer, oh, they must have been in love because of the way they were acting, or they must have been angry because the way they were acting. You judge by their physiology. They're clenching their fists, they're clenching their jaws, they're smiling, and by things they say. And the same way, if you look at people's behavior, you can see how they've been changed and whether they are feeling unconditional love or whether they're feeling fear. So you infer from their voice and their physiology and their behavior what's going on in their mind, but you can't read the mind directly.
So if somebody comes to you and says, all right, Bruce, this is wacko stuff, I can't buy into this, right? Like there's a lot of people who would probably think that I'm wacko for even considering it, but I do. I think it's legitimate, like this deserves a lot of research and attention. I believe that. What would be your response to those people? And this is why it's worth it.
Yeah. Well, I understand where they're coming from because I started out that way. So I understand. I think it's good to be skeptical. And I don't think I have the answers. But I think I do have evidence that the current answers of neurophysiology are not complete, that we need more than what we have now to understand things like near-death experiences. And there are lots of other things besides near-death experiences that science just doesn't have an explanation for. And I mean, the simplest thing is, how does a brain create a thought? You know, the brain looking at physical, chemical, and electric changes in the brain. How do they create a thought or an emotion? No one has any idea. We haven't got the slightest hint of a suggestion of an idea of how to go about making a theory about this.
Right.
It's just completely foreign to us.
It's crazy. It's that whole concept right there of the going into a thought. You can't measure that, but it's happening.
It is. There's no question about that. And it changes people's lives.
Yeah. The power of thought is kind of going back to this concept of vibration, really fascinating to me, because I've been playing with this a lot. A lot of what I talk with people just about and what I coach on is sort of people's perceptions of their own potential. And I think a lot of times food can hold us back, and the substances we take in can hold us back, you know, whether it's like alcohol or processed foods, right? Because it changes the way you think and how you think. And if you're so anxious all the time, you don't really have the freedom of thought to, the thought is what I think is where creation and everything comes from. And so tying it back into near-death experiences, I feel like there has to be something to do with frequencies in the study of vibration that's falling into how these happen or what people feel like.
Right. Yeah, the difficulty is that when scientists talk about vibrations, you have to say what it is that's vibrating. Are they sound waves vibrating? Are they electromagnetic waves that are vibrating? And vibrations, in the sense that you're using them and that near-death experiences talk about them, we don't know what's vibrating. We just sense that it's a vibration. But what it is that's vibrating, we can't specify. So that makes it difficult for scientists to grapple with these ideas.
It's funny too, because don't you think even what you're doing right now, it's kind of challenging science, but so much of what science lacks is the ability to measure certain things. Like we always want to measure things, right? We always want to measure, but at a certain point, like sometimes I'm almost like, man, nature is what nature is. And sometimes maybe it's just way smarter than we are, except, I mean, all the time it is, right? So I get the value of measuring things, but that doesn't, just because we can't measure it sometimes doesn't, to me, mean that it's always like the foolproof 100%. Because if we know thoughts exist, but we don't know how to measure them, that's proof enough right there that we lack things to understand our realities.
Well, amazingly, there are philosophers who say that no, thoughts don't exist. That's just a delusion. You just think you're thinking.
Really?
Yeah. But, science makes progress over the centuries in how they measure things. Before we had microscopes, you couldn't know that there were objects too small to see, like bacteria. So no one could form a theory of bacteria because they didn't know they existed. And when you develop telescopes, you could see stars that you couldn't see otherwise. So as we develop technologies, that opens up better avenues for measuring things. And we're still just scraping the surface of what's out there to be able to measure. I mean, most physicists think that the amount of matter in the universe that we can see is 5%. The other 95% is dark matter that we can't measure in any way. Well, if almost all the matter in the universe is stuff we can't measure, how can we think we know what's going on
right.
here?
At all.
But beyond being able to measure it, most near-death experiencers, when you say, tell me what happened, they say, I can't. There aren't any words for it. And that's the basic problem, that what they experience in this other realm, if it is a realm, is so far beyond our vocabularies that they have to use metaphors to describe it. And the metaphors, of course, aren't the real thing. So when they say, I met God, as many of them do, they may quickly say, well, it's not the God I was taught about in church. I'm just using that word because I don't know what else to call it. but it's something that's all encompassing, all loving, all giving, and I'm part of it. But they don't know what to call it.
Has there been one story in particular that talked to, let's say, specifically about God, or something that really caught your attention with these things that challenged your beliefs, maybe?
There were just so many.
Yeah, they're all different, right?
And and most of them talk about somehow being part of it, part of the whole thing. Many of them use a metaphor like being a wave in the ocean, and like God is the ocean, and we're a wave that's in the ocean, made of the same stuff, but we're separate because we have a separate structure of the wave. But we're not going to have that structure forever, and eventually the wave will melt back into the ocean and become part of the original Godhead. Others have said that it's like looking at your fingers. They look like they're separate things. But if you look at the whole hand, you see they're also interconnected, and you can't separate them really. So we're all part of the same thing. And that they experience that in their near-death experience. They aren't told it. They experience it. So they come back thinking, I am you, and you are me. And that makes them embrace what we call the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is part of every religion we have. Every religion has this: treat other people like you want to be treated. But for the near-death experiencer, it's not a guideline we're supposed to follow. They experienced it as a law of nature. That's just the way things are.
Law of nature.
We're all attached.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, because personally, I don't abide to like any particular religion, though I absolutely value religion, and I think that it's a beautiful thing. Many of my friends are Catholic, many are Christian, many are Jewish, all different creeds. I would certainly say I believe in God, and I would definitely say, in my way of putting it all together, I believe in the 10 Commandments and the 7 sins, in the sense that that's like a law of nature kind of approach. If you lie, that's kind of a vibrational intention behind it that brings something back to you that you're not probably going to love. Over time, it might not be immediately, right? But it might result in not a favorable result, right? And so I believe in, ultimately, like, as maybe lame as it sounds, energy. And I do believe in a higher power. Has this changed you and your religious beliefs?
Yeah. Well, I started out without any religious beliefs, and I still kind of feel that way. Most near-death experiencers say they become more spiritual, but they don't become more religious. And they say that they can appreciate that we're all interconnected and all part of something that's divine, but they feel at home in any house of worship of any denomination, or just out in nature. And it's hard to talk to thousands and thousands of near-death experiencers and not absorb some of that.
Yeah.
So, I've become, I think, much more spiritual than I was before, which wasn't hard because I wasn't spiritual at all before.
Well, define spiritual. What does that mean? Because I think people have a different.
Well, it's just, yeah, that's a good point, Lauren, because I think people do define it differently. But the way most near-death experiencers define it, they mean a sense of being connected, intimately connected to other people, to the natural world, to animals, to trees, to the divine, to the universe, and feel like they're a part of everything. And I kind of feel that sense also, that we're not alone here. We're part of something greater that is actually something that's benign. And that makes it kind of hard to hurt other people or to misuse other people, because you feel like you're just hurting yourself when you do this. And it also makes you less frightened of dying, because you have a sense that death is not the end, that there seems to be something more. And what that more is not something to be afraid of. Many of us growing up in this achievement-oriented Western culture define ourselves by our achievements. And we need to stay in control of ourselves to do that. So we place a high value on controlling your life. And in a near-death experience, you're out of control. You have no control over that. And that can be frightening for a lot of people. And they think of death as being that way. If they think of death as being either nothing, which for some reason frightens them, or being something that they're not in control of, they don't like that at all. And after a near-death experience, you think it's fine being out of control. I was in this experience, I had no control, and I felt better than ever.
I was fine.
So now that I'm back in this life, I don't need to be in control. So I trust it's going to work out okay.
Develops a sense of trust.
Definitely.
Yeah. That's what I keep hearing too.
Yep. You know, when I first started hearing this from near-death experiencers, that they're no longer afraid of dying, I started worrying as a psychiatrist, is this going to make people suicidal if I tell them this? Because I'd worked with a lot of people who were thinking about ending their lives, but were afraid because they thought something bad might happen if I kill myself. And here's a near-death experiencer saying, nothing bad's going to happen. Death is wonderful.
Oh, yeah. So you're like, is this going to convince them?
Yeah. So I did a study of people who were admitted to my hospital with a suicide attempt. And I looked at those who had a near-death experience as a result of the suicide attempt and those who didn't. And to my surprise, I found those who had a near-death experience were much less suicidal afterwards than those who didn't have an NDE. And when I asked them why, they said a variety of things. They said, well, if you're not afraid of death, then you're also not afraid of life. You can go ahead and live to the fullest and take chances, take risks. What's the worst that can happen? You die, which is good.
Yeah.
And they also said that they have a sense now that there's a meaning and purpose to everything. And the problems they have, which they used to think were a reason to try to escape life, they now see as things they're supposed to learn from and grow from. And they're here for a reason. And they're back here for a reason. They didn't die. They came back or were sent back for a reason. And
that's the common thread with most of them, is that they come back with that, right?
Yes.
That there's like a point for them returning.
Some say they were given a choice and they came back for a certain reason. Like, I needed to raise my children, or I needed to help my father die, or something like this. Others don't know why they came back. They were told, you've got more work to do. They don't know what it is, but they accepted it and they came back. Others were sent back against their will. They didn't want to come back. And they were told, no, it's not your time. You're going back.
With people that have experienced near-death experiences, I've heard that people, they sometimes have this acute awareness of dangerous things coming before they happen. Have you heard that before?
Yes. Not all of them by any means, but there are some that do have premonitions.
Yeah.
And they are usually of dangerous things that are going to happen.
Yeah. There was a woman that I spoke with who told me that she was little when she had a near-death experience, and then her mom didn't like that she had that. It kind of weirded her out a little bit. So she sort of suppressed it in her daughter. Her daughter was like 8 years old, maybe 9. And anyways, before the two of them were walking across the street, she was 8 years old. She told her mom, like, there's going to be a car, I think, that's going to come by and there's going to be an accident. And her mom was like, what are you talking about? Give it 10 seconds. Car came by, crashed into another car, and they didn't walk across the street because she was holding her mom back, and it freaked her mom out. But it was legitimate. That girl, the 8-year-old, had apparently had a near-death experience when she was like a toddler. So is that common, that kind of a thing?
It's not common, but it does happen. I get calls and now emails often from near-death experiencers who know me, who give me warnings about things that are going to happen. And often they're not terribly specific. For example, before the Chernobyl disaster, that's a couple of decades ago now, I got a lot of calls from people saying that there's going to be a nuclear explosion somewhere in Russia or Eastern Europe, and it's going to devastate a huge area, and it's going to be sometime this summer. But they couldn't get more specific than that. And it happened. Now, you may say, well, that's a pretty likely prediction, but they were specific about the rough time it was going to happen and where it was going to happen. And it was a totally devastating experience.
There were multiple people that told you this?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've gotten others that were more specific. Like someone told me that there's an airplane that's going to crash is leaving a city in Eastern Asia, and it takes off from the airport, and it goes over a bridge. And as it's going over the bridge, it loses engines, and it tilts 90 degrees to the right and crashes into the bridge. and it was a white plane, and she described how many people were on the plane, and a few other things like that. And she was so impressed by this that she emailed me about it, and she emailed herself about it too, so she'd have a record of it. And the next day, like 24 hours later, there was a crash of a plane leaving Taiwan. That the pictures in the newspaper looked exactly like she was describing. It was a plane that was upright on its side, 90 degrees to the right, and it was crashing into a bridge just out of the airport. And the number of people, 93, on the plane who died was exactly what she had said it was.
And she sent this to you in an email?
Yeah.
And you have the dates like documented? It was definitely the day before?
Yes.
And is that like a common occurrence?
It's not common. It's not common, but it does happen.
Wow. That's crazy.
I had one fellow that I knew very well would see things like there was a 4-year-old girl in his town who had gotten lost, and he had this vision of where she was. So he took the police into the woods. They didn't know whether she was dead, whether she was alive, and he took them into the woods to where he thought she was going to be found. And they did find her there. And they arrested him because they thought he was a kidnapper. Because how would he know about this? And it took a while for him to convince them that he didn't know anything about it. He didn't know anything about how she got there. And then the child eventually said, "No, I never saw this guy before. I just wandered into the woods and got lost."
So was that a near-death experience, or was that a guy who has had one?
He had a near-death experience before this.
Oh, so this is one of those premonition type things.
Yeah, yeah.
Wild.
Yeah. So he stopped telling people about it.
Yeah, I mean, you would. I mean, unfortunately, though, it helped. It did help her. But so do they describe this as like they're sleeping and it happens, or are they just existing and they see something? Are they napping? Are they meditating?
It's both. They have dreams about them. Sometimes they have waking visions of them. They often see it. Sometimes they hear a voice telling them about it.
Wow. You would sound crazy if you said that stuff. You would. Yeah. Just based off of what our context is on, like, what is it, like sociopaths? Is it sociopaths, or like, what are the ones that they hear voices?
Psychotic patients often hear voices.
So what's the difference between those people and these people in your experience?
Good question. I did a study with Mitch Leister, another psychiatrist, where we looked at near-death experiencers who continued to hear voices, and then schizophrenic patients who were hearing voices. And we had them describe what the experience was like and how it affected them. And the near-death experiencers almost exclusively liked hearing these voices. They felt they were helpful, they enriched their lives, and they made their lives easier. And the schizophrenics, almost without exception, said they hated having this happen to them. They felt it was painful, it was frightening to them, and they wished it could stop, but they couldn't make it stop, and it really ruined their lives. So I don't know whether they're really hearing something or just hallucinating it, but it certainly wasn't helping them, whereas the near-death experiencers felt it was helping them.
Okay, so it's all around the sentiment around it.
At least that.
And was there any characteristic differences in the sound of the voice? Or, is it typically, if it is a voice, is it typically a male voice, a female voice? It's kind of androgynous, you can't tell?
Yeah, it's usually, you can't detect what it is, usually.
You cannot?
Yeah.
Wow. What about the feeling that they might get when they, I guess, post hearing the voice? Is there anything there? Like, is there dread continued for people that are, not enjoying it, and then joy continued for people that maybe had near-death experiences?
Well, we haven't really looked into that much, so I can't say too much about that.
Okay. The reason I hear, when I've interviewed a couple people that were, Penny was one of the women that I interviewed. I'm blanking on her last name right now, but she has a really compelling story where she passed away supposedly in the hospital, and then popped into her sister's car, and her sister was in another state, and she was in the back seat and her sister was in the front seat, and her sister was typing a private message on Facebook to the woman who's died daughter. So essentially the woman who was driving was writing a Facebook private message to her niece saying, like, I'll be there soon. And to this day, that's now that Penny, who had the near-death experience, explained that to her sister, it's caused like a rift, because it's thrown her sister off so much that she can't accept it, basically. It's a really, the whole thing is so interesting to even just talk about. So you said finally like that to about 5% of the population, 1 in 20 people has a near-death experience?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now a lot of them don't have these more extreme things that you're talking about. The so-called paranormal effects afterwards, but some of them do, and some of them just happen. It happens once in their lives. Sometimes it happens during the experience itself. For example, one fellow I knew tried to hang himself.
Okay.
He was a farmer. He went out in his shed in his back, and rigged up, threw a rope over a rafter and tied it around his neck, and kicked a chair out from under him. And he did not die. He was just hanging there on the rope. He didn't do it properly. And he's hanging there on the rope, feeling a lot of pain, feeling himself get choked, but not dying. And he was terrified by it. So he said he went into his kitchen where his wife was making dinner and started yelling at her to come cut me down. Of course, he's still hanging out there in the shed. His wife stopped what she was doing, grabbed a sharp kitchen knife, ran out to the shed and back, and cut him down. And when I asked her about it later, she said, I was standing there by the sink, and I was washing vegetables, and I heard his voice inside my head saying, come cut me down, I'm in the shed. And she didn't know where it happened, but she just grabbed a knife and ran out there. So I don't know how to explain that.
She told you this?
Yeah.
Was there any chance possibly that she could have heard him from the space, or was it too far away? Could he yell?
I don't know. It was pretty far away, but I don't know. Maybe if he was shouting loud enough, it's possible.
I guess if you're
he was choking.
Yeah.
I don't know how he could shout. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. Like, you probably can't.
Yeah. So many of these stories, unfortunately, don't happen under controlled circumstances where you can really control all the variables. Mm-hmm. So we can't consider them really, solid experiments. Yeah, I think it really challenges the idea that all our thoughts and feelings and perceptions are created by the brain. They're certainly in everyday life associated with brain activity, but that doesn't mean they're created by it. So I'd like to see our models of how the brain and mind work expand a little. And that may take some time to do. But these experiences certainly suggest that under extreme circumstances, the mind can function when the brain is not. And if that's true, if the mind can function when the brain is going offline, that raises the question of whether the mind can continue to function after the brain dies completely, after our bodies die. Can the mind or some part of our consciousness continue functioning? And certainly near-death experiences suggest that can happen. Well, there are a lot of people who are looking into it now. I mentioned before the idea that the brain somehow receives and filters thoughts from the mind. Well, if that's true, how does it do that? And there are neuroscientists who are looking into mechanisms in the brain that might receive and filter these vibrations, or whatever you want to call them. Ed Kelly at the University of Virginia and David Presti at Berkeley are working together on some of these things. Marjorie Willicott at University of Oregon is doing some of this stuff. So that people, and there are groups in New Zealand and in Belgium, in Germany, that are looking at different ways of imagining the mind-brain interaction. It used to be if you ask people 50 years ago, if you ask scientists 50 years ago, how do the mind and the brain interact? They would say, well, the mind is what the brain does. But studies done in recent years in several different countries have shown that when you ask scientists now, are the mind and the brain the same thing? 50% of them say, no, they're not. So that's a huge change.